Imagine waking up one morning, stepping outside with a cup of coffee in hand, expecting the same peaceful view you've enjoyed for years, the sound of water flowing, the glistening surface of a little creek that winds behind your property, the natural rhythm that gives your backyard life. But instead of that familiar sight, you're greeted with something shocking. The creek is gone, not because it dried up or because of some natural shift in the earth, but because someone, without warning or permission, poured thick, heavy slabs of concrete into it. The water, the natural beauty, the very thing that gave balance to the land was suffocated under gray stone and gravel. And not just someone, but the very people who were supposed to look out for the neighborhood. The Homeowners Association. At first, I thought it was some kind of mistake. Maybe a construction crew in the wrong place, working on the wrong project. But the more I looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't an accident. It was intentional. The entire channel of the creek was sealed, every curve and bend filled in as if the water had never been there. What used to be a living ecosystem was now an ugly scar of concrete, cutting through the land like a wound. My heart sank, not just because I loved that creek, but because I knew enough about nature to realize what this meant. That creek wasn't just a pretty background. It was the neighborhood's natural drainage system. Every drop of rain, every storm surge, every runoff from the streets flowed through it, guiding water safely away from homes and yards. By blocking it, the HOA hadn't just erased a part of nature, they had sabotaged the entire balance of the neighborhood. Why would they do something so reckless? I didn't have to wait long to find out. At the next HOA notice board update, tucked into the usual pile of rules and self-important announcements, was their so-called explanation. They had declared the creek an eyesore and a mosquito hazard. According to them, filling it with concrete would beautify the neighborhood and make it healthier for everyone. They framed it like they had done us all a favor, but let me tell you, there was nothing healthy about destroying a natural waterway. Anyone with a shred of common sense could see the flaw in their plan. That creek wasn't a decorative pond you could just cover up because you didn't like how it looked. It was vital, part of the land's design. Removing it would be like sealing up the air vents in your house and then wondering why you couldn't breathe. The anger hit me like a wave. Who gave them the right? Who sat around in some board meeting and decided they knew better than nature? They didn't ask for input. They didn't consult experts. They didn't even bother to mention it until it was done. The arrogance was unbelievable. I wanted to march right over to the HOA president's house and demand an explanation, but I knew it would be pointless. She was the type who walked around with a clipboard, giving orders, pretending to be the queen of the block. People like her didn't listen. They dictated. I tried to calm myself, telling myself maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad. Maybe somehow the neighborhood would be okay. But deep down, I knew better. You don't tamper with a natural drainage system and get away with it. The land always remembers. The water always finds a way. And if you block its path, it doesn't just disappear. It builds, it pushes, and eventually it strikes back. As I stood staring at that ugly slab of concrete where my creek used to be, I felt a knot in my stomach. I thought of the storms that rolled through every summer, the kind that turned the skies dark and unleashed buckets of rain. I pictured that water, trapped with nowhere to go, piling up higher and higher until it spilled over into the streets, the lawns, the basements. I knew it was only a matter of time before disaster came knocking, and the cruel irony was that it wouldn't hit me the hardest. My property sat a little higher, safe on a small rise, but the houses downstream, the ones belonging to the very people who supported the HOA's decision, they were in the line of fire. There's a saying, when you fight against nature, nature always wins. Standing there that morning, coffee growing cold in my hand, I realized that this wasn't just a bad decision by a group of power-hungry neighbors. It was a ticking time bomb. They had poured concrete into the lifeline of the neighborhood, and sooner or later, everyone was going to pay the price. But in that moment, all I could do was shake my head. The HOA thought they were protecting property values, thought they were making the community better. Instead, they had sown the seeds of their own destruction. And the cruelest part? I wouldn't even have to lift a finger for karma to arrive. The rain would do all the talking for me. The first time it rained after the creek had been filled with concrete, I stood at my window and watched as if I were witnessing a slow-motion disaster. At first, it was just a light drizzle, the kind of rain that usually soaked the grass and filled the creek with a gentle trickle. That's when I realized something was wrong. Instead of that familiar rushing sound of water moving along its natural path, there was silence, an unnatural silence that made me uneasy. Then the rain picked up, heavy drops pounding against the roof and splashing off the driveway. Within minutes, water began to pool in places it had never pooled before. Normally, the creek would have been carrying all that rainwater downstream, sweeping it out of the neighborhood and toward the larger river miles away. But now, with a giant slab of concrete blocking its way, the water had nowhere to go. I watched as puddles appeared, spreading wider and deeper with every passing second. What should have been harmless runoff turned into standing water, then swelling pools that crept across lawns and driveways. At first, some neighbors stepped outside, umbrellas in hand, shaking their heads and laughing it off. They thought it was just one of those rains. They thought it would pass, that the water would drain as it always had. But I knew better. I could see the panic growing in their eyes when they realized the water wasn't moving. It wasn't draining at all, it was rising. The situation turned serious fast. Driveways disappeared under inches of murky water. Garden beds drowned. Yards became muddy swamps in less than an hour. One family across the street opened their garage to try to pull out their car, but the water rushed in so quickly that it was already lapping at their tires before they could back out. They slammed the door shut in frustration, their vehicle trapped like a toy in a bathtub. And the basements, those were the worst. I could see neighbors sprinting out with buckets and pumps, trying desperately to stop water from seeping inside. But nature doesn't wait for you to get ready. Once it starts, it takes over. Basement windows, low vents, tiny cracks in foundations, all became entry points for the water that had nowhere else to go. Within hours, families were hauling soggy carpets, ruined furniture, and boxes of treasured belongings up the stairs and out into the storm. One man, frantic and desperate, grabbed a rake and tried to clear a storm drain on the corner, thinking maybe it was clogged with leaves. He worked like his life depended on it, stabbing at the grate, pulling away handfuls of debris. But no matter how hard he tried, the water level didn't budge. Because the truth was simple. The problem wasn't a clogged drain. The problem was the creek, the lifeline of our neighborhood, was suffocated under concrete. I stood there dry and safe behind my window and felt a mix of emotions. On the one hand, I was relieved my home sat on slightly higher ground. I wasn't immune, but the water wasn't threatening me the way it was threatening them. On the other hand, I couldn't help but feel anger. This wasn't an act of God. This wasn't some freak storm no one could have predicted. This was man-made. This was preventable. This was the HOA's arrogance playing out in real time, and it was my neighbors paying the price. When the storm finally slowed down and the skies lightened, the damage was impossible to ignore. Lawns were ruined, stripped bare, and waterlogged. Trash cans floated like buoys down the street. The smell of dampness clung to the air, heavy and sour. But the real heartbreak was inside people's homes. Soggy drywall, warped wood floors, electrical systems compromised by water. It was devastation. Families dragged their belongings outside, forming sad piles of ruined couches, mattresses, toys, and books on the curb. Children cried, watching their favorite stuffed animals ruined. Parents argued, exhausted and overwhelmed, trying to figure out how they would even begin to recover. Insurance agents started showing up, clipboards in hand, documenting losses and shaking their heads. Some neighbors quickly realized their policies wouldn't even cover the damage because it was considered flooding, and they hadn't paid for flood insurance. Who would have thought they'd need flood insurance in a neighborhood that had never once experienced flooding before? That creek had always protected us, quietly doing its job in the background, until someone decided it was unnecessary. The conversations among neighbors shifted. At first they muttered about the storm, blaming the weather. But as they stood around looking at the concrete-filled creek, it clicked. The storm wasn't the enemy. The HOA was. If the creek had been left alone, the water would have been swept away like it always had. Instead, the very decision they praised as beautifying the community had backfired spectacularly. And the irony? My yard, the one that bordered the creek most directly, was barely touched. The HOA had thought they were solving a problem for me, that they were doing me a favor by getting rid of what they called a mosquito pit. But because of my home's slightly higher elevation, I was fine. Meanwhile, the board members who had signed off on the concrete project were the ones dealing with soaked floors, ruined basements, and insurance nightmares. That first flood changed everything. It wasn't just water in the streets, it was the spark that lit a fire of frustration. People were angry, not just at the water, but at themselves for not questioning the HOA earlier. They had trusted them to make smart decisions, to protect the community. Instead, their trust had been betrayed, and their homes had paid the price. As the storm drains slowly emptied out the last of the floodwater and the streets dried up, one thing became crystal clear. This wasn't a one-time disaster. The creek had been permanently altered. The next rain, the next storm, the next season, it would all play out the same way. This wasn't the end of the flooding. It was just the beginning. The days after the flood felt heavy, not just because of the damage, but because of the tension building in the neighborhood. Everyone was talking about what had happened, whispering in driveways, pointing toward the creek and shaking their heads. The HOA tried to keep control of the narrative, but it wasn't working. Too many people had lost too much and they wanted answers. So when the next HOA meeting rolled around, the room was more crowded than I'd ever seen it. Usually only a handful of people showed up, mostly the same faces, the ones who liked to gossip or complain about lawns not being trimmed evenly. But this time, the room was packed wall to wall with angry, tired homeowners who wanted accountability. The HOA president strutted in like nothing was wrong, clipboard in hand, a fake smile plastered across her face. She started the meeting with the usual agenda: lawn maintenance, community events, and even a note about painting fences a uniform color to maintain property values. People shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, muttering under their breath. Then finally someone shouted what everyone else was thinking. What about the flood? What about the creek? The room erupted. One by one, voices rose, people demanding explanations. Families stood up and listed the damages they had suffered. Ruined furniture, destroyed appliances, repairs that were going to cost thousands. They asked why no one had been consulted, why such a massive decision had been made in secret. The president tried to calm the crowd, raising her hand and saying, "Please, one at a time," but no one listened. The trust was gone. When I finally got the chance to speak, I kept my voice steady, though inside I was boiling. I asked the questions I knew they didn't want to hear. Who approved this? Did you consult an engineer? Did you file any permits with the city? Did you get any environmental clearance at all? The room fell silent for a moment, everyone waiting for the answers. But there were none. The president stammered, fumbling with her papers, and finally said something vague about a majority vote within the board. That was when I realized the truth. They had acted entirely on their own authority. No experts, no permits, no votes from the homeowners who actually lived with the consequences. They had just decided the creek was ugly and inconvenient, hired a contractor and sealed it up. The president tried to spin it, claiming they had done it for the good of the neighborhood. She said things like, "We wanted to improve the appearance of our community, and it's better for property values if we don't have standing water attracting mosquitoes." But as soon as she mentioned property values, a man in the back stood up, his voice shaking with anger. "Property values? Are you kidding me? My insurance just went up $500 a year. Who's going to buy a house in a neighborhood that floods every time it rains?" That hit hard. Heads nodded all over the room. People started chiming in with their own stories of insurance nightmares, realtors advising them not to sell, buyers pulling out after seeing water damage. The very thing the HOA claimed to be protecting, property values, was the thing they had destroyed. The more they tried to defend themselves, the worse it got. One board member even tried to suggest that the flood was a freak event, a storm stronger than usual, something no one could have predicted. But the homeowners weren't buying it. They knew the creek had handled far worse storms in the past without a single issue. The only thing different this time was the concrete. As the meeting went on, the frustration in the room grew thicker. It wasn't just about the flood anymore. It was about years of small power plays, rules enforced unfairly, and decisions made without transparency. This incident was just the breaking point, the moment when people finally saw through the HOA's facade. The anger that had been simmering quietly for years had boiled over. By the end of the night, people were demanding resignations. They wanted the president and the entire board to step down. They wanted answers in writing, records of who approved the project, receipts of how much money had been spent. The board promised to look into it, but no one was satisfied. The trust had been shattered beyond repair. Walking home from that meeting, I couldn't help but feel a strange mix of emotions. On one hand, I was glad the truth was out in the open. People finally understood what I had been saying all along. The creek wasn't just a patch of water, it was essential to our community. On the other hand, I felt sorry for the families caught in the crossfire, the ones who were paying for repairs they couldn't afford because of someone else's arrogance. What struck me most, though, was how quickly people turned on the HOA once the damage hit their own doorsteps. Before the flood, they had blindly trusted the board, nodding along to every decision, believing the president when she claimed to have the neighborhood's best interests at heart. But as soon as water poured into their basements, that blind loyalty vanished. It made me wonder, why does it always take disaster for people to open their eyes? Why couldn't they see the problem before the damage was done? Over the next few days, conversations shifted from blame to action. Neighbors started talking about lawsuits, about filing complaints with the city, about organizing to vote out the entire board. Flyers began circulating, urging people to come together and hold the HOA accountable. For the first time, there was unity in the neighborhood. Not the kind the HOA had always bragged about, but real unity born from shared suffering. Meanwhile, the president tried to save face, sending out emails filled with excuses and promises of future improvements. But no amount of sugarcoating could undo the fact that her decision had destroyed trust, finances, and homes. She had wanted to cement her legacy, literally and figuratively, but all she had managed to do was cement the creek and sink her own reputation. What the HOA didn't seem to realize was that this wasn't just about concrete and water. This was about arrogance, about the belief that a handful of people could play God with nature and not face consequences. And the cruel twist was that the very people who thought they were protecting their property values were the ones who had the most to lose. The flood didn't hit me hardest, it hit them. The ones who sat on that board nodded along and told everyone they knew best. Looking back, that meeting was the turning point. It was the moment the blame game officially began. The moment the neighborhood stopped seeing the HOA as a group of protectors and started seeing them for what they really were. Reckless, self-serving decision-makers who had put their own pride above the safety of the community. And while they tried to deny responsibility, everyone in that room knew the truth. The flood wasn't an accident. It wasn't an act of nature. It was the direct result of their arrogance. The second storm came faster than anyone expected. The first flood had left people shaken, but many still clung to the hope that it had been a fluke, a one-time thing that wouldn't happen again. They patched up their basements, replaced their carpets, and tried to get on with life. The HOA even sent out an email insisting that the community was resilient and that the storm had been extraordinary, a weather event that could not have been predicted. But nature doesn't read emails. Nature doesn't care about excuses. And when the skies opened up again, it was clear that this wasn't a one-time disaster. It was the new normal. It started with heavy clouds rolling in on a Thursday afternoon, thick and low, painting the neighborhood in shadows. The wind picked up, rattling windows and bending trees, and then came the rain. Hard, relentless sheets of water pouring from the sky. I watched from my porch as the gutters overflowed within minutes, water rushing down the street in small rivers. At first I wondered if maybe, just maybe, the water would find some way to escape. But then I remembered the concrete, the sealed-off creek, and I knew what was coming before it happened. The water rose faster this time. The ground was still saturated from the first flood, and the drainage system was already compromised. Lawns didn't just turn soggy, they became lakes. Driveways disappeared under brown, swirling currents. Within an hour, cars were sitting in knee-deep water, their alarms blaring as the electrical systems shorted out. Children were crying as parents tried to carry them through the rising flood to higher ground. The sound of rushing water mixed with the shouts of panic, a soundtrack of chaos that echoed through the neighborhood, and the damage wasn't limited to flooded basements anymore. The pressure of all that water started to take a toll on the very foundations of the homes. One neighbor's house made a sickening cracking sound as the ground beneath it shifted, the foundation buckling under the weight of trapped water. Another family's backyard simply collapsed, the earth caving in to reveal a gaping, muddy sinkhole that swallowed fences and trees like they were toys. It wasn't just inconvenient anymore, it was catastrophic. The HOA board members, who had been so smug and dismissive after the first flood, were now in full panic mode. They ran from house to house trying to calm people down, but their words carried no weight. Everyone knew who was responsible. Everyone could see the massive concrete slab that had turned the neighborhood into a disaster zone. One board member tried to tell me it was just bad luck, but I cut him off. I told him this wasn't luck. This was cause and effect. You block a natural waterway, you pay the price. He didn't have a response, just stood there drenched and defeated. It wasn't long before city officials got involved. Emergency crews waded through the streets, setting up barriers and helping families evacuate. They looked baffled at first, as though they couldn't believe a neighborhood like ours could flood this badly. Then they saw the creek, or what was left of it, and their faces changed. Shock, disbelief, then anger. The city engineers pointed out what was obvious to anyone with common sense. The creek was a natural drainage system. By filling it with concrete, the HOA had violated environmental regulations and building codes. What they had done wasn't just foolish, it was illegal. The fines came swiftly, but they were just the beginning. The city ordered an investigation. Insurance companies refused to cover damages, and homeowners were left staring at bills that stretched into the tens of thousands. One family broke down crying on their front lawn, realizing their life savings were gone. Another neighbor started talking about moving out, but when they contacted a realtor, they were told the house was essentially unsellable until the flooding issue was resolved. Property values, the very thing the HOA had claimed to protect, had plummeted, and through it all, my house remained relatively safe. My yard was wet, sure, but the water never climbed high enough to reach my doors. From my elevated lot, I could see the destruction spreading across the rest of the neighborhood, and I couldn't help but feel a bitter sense of irony. The HOA had acted like they were doing me a favor by eliminating the creek. In reality, they had destroyed their own homes while leaving mine untouched. Karma doesn't always wait. It sometimes strikes right away, and it was striking them harder than they could have ever imagined. The community meetings that followed were filled with shouting, accusations, and tears. Homeowners demanded answers, demanded solutions, demanded accountability. The HOA board, once so confident, now sat red-faced and silent as people screamed at them. One man slammed his fist on the table, shouting that his family was ruined. Another woman demanded the president resign immediately. The board tried to offer temporary fixes, sandbags, pumping stations, even talks of digging artificial trenches, but no one was convinced. Everyone knew there was only one real solution. The creek had to be restored. The problem was, restoring the creek wouldn't be easy. The concrete wasn't just dumped in. It was poured, hardened, and reinforced. Digging it out would take months of labor and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. Money the HOA didn't have. Money the homeowners didn't want to spend after already suffering so much loss. The board was trapped, and they knew it. Every option led to more pain, more expense, more anger from the very people they were supposed to represent. The pressure mounted day by day. News outlets even picked up the story, calling it a man-made disaster, and interviewing frustrated families standing knee-deep in their ruined basements. Reporters asked tough questions about the HOA's decision-making, about their lack of permits, about their disregard for expert advice. The board members avoided cameras, hiding in their homes as their reputations crumbled. The president, who had once strutted through the neighborhood with pride, now hurried from her car to her door with her head down, avoiding eye contact with anyone. It was clear to everyone, karma had come swiftly and mercilessly. The creek, silenced under concrete, had found its voice again in the form of devastating floods. The land had rebelled. The water had reclaimed its path, and the arrogance of a few had destroyed the peace of many. The HOA had wanted control, had wanted to impose their will on nature, but all they had managed to do was prove a timeless truth. You can't fight nature and win. As I stood on my porch one evening, watching the sun set over a neighborhood still scarred by the storm, I realized something profound. I didn't need to argue with the HOA anymore. I didn't need to waste energy fighting them in meetings or trying to prove I was right. Nature was doing that for me, louder and clearer than I ever could. Every drop of rain was a reminder of their mistake. Every flooded basement, a lesson in humility. They had buried the creek in concrete, but in doing so, they had buried their own credibility, their own authority, their own future, and the rains, I knew, would keep coming. Eventually, the HOA had no choice but to face reality. The damage was too severe, the complaints too loud, and the evidence too undeniable. They couldn't spin it anymore, couldn't blame the storms or call it an unusual weather event. Everyone knew the truth, and the truth was written in the soggy drywall. The collapsed backyards, the cracked foundations, and the endless insurance battles. Their so-called improvement project had turned into a disaster that would take years to recover from. And finally, in their desperation, they came to me. I remember the knock on my door. It was late in the evening, the kind of night where the air still smelled like damp earth and mildew from the most recent flood. When I opened it, there stood the HOA president, clipboard gone, umbrella dripping at her side, her posture no longer confident but defeated. Behind her were two other board members, equally miserable, their clothes wrinkled, their expressions weary. For a moment, I almost didn't recognize them. These weren't the arrogant people who once strutted through neighborhood meetings barking orders. These were broken leaders, humbled by their own mistakes. We need your help," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Part of me wanted to slam the door in their faces. After all the arrogance, after the lectures and dismissals, after treating me like a nuisance for daring to ask questions, now they wanted my advice? Now they admitted they didn't know what they were doing? But I didn't slam the door. I just let them stand there, soaked and uncomfortable, before finally saying, "What do you think I can do for you?" They explained that the city had given them an ultimatum: restore the creek or face massive fines and possible lawsuits. The contractor they hired to pour the concrete was long gone, refusing to accept responsibility. The board didn't know how to fix the mess, and the homeowners were demanding immediate action. They were out of money, out of ideas, and out of time. And in that moment, they admitted what I had known all along. They should never have touched the creek in the first place. I took a breath, steadying myself, and then I told them the truth. The only way forward is to undo what you did. Dig out the concrete, restore the creek to its natural state, and let the water flow again. You can't fight against nature. You have to work with it. They nodded, defeated, knowing I was right. But knowing it and doing it were two very different things. Restoring the creek wasn't going to be simple. It would take months of work, heavy machinery, and more money than the HOA had ever imagined spending. Homeowners would have to be assessed, fees would skyrocket, and the neighborhood would be under construction for a long time. The board members winced as they realized how unpopular this would make them. But at this point, they didn't have a choice. Word spread quickly through the neighborhood, and reactions were mixed. Some were relieved that a solution was finally in sight, even if it meant more disruption. Others were furious that they'd have to pay for the board's mistakes, their HOA dues suddenly tripling to cover the costs. Lawsuits were filed, some homeowners refusing to pay a dime, arguing that the people responsible should foot the bill personally. The neighborhood turned into a battlefield, not against nature this time, but against each other. Friendships fractured, neighbors stopped speaking, and trust was at an all-time low. Still, the work began. Excavators and trucks rolled in, tearing up the concrete, hauling out chunks of stone that had once suffocated the creek. Day after day, crews dug deeper, trying to carve back the path the water had once taken freely. And slowly, almost like nature herself was forgiving us, the creek began to reappear. At first, it was just a trickle of water finding its way through the cracks. Then it grew into a steady flow, winding its way along the channel, as if it had been waiting for this moment all along. The first time the creek ran clear again after a rainfall, it was almost beautiful. Standing there, I could hear the water rushing, that familiar sound that had once been part of daily life. It was like the neighborhood was breathing again, finally able to exhale after months of holding its breath. And the difference was immediate. Yards drained faster, basements stayed dry, and the threat of flooding lessened with every passing storm. The solution had always been simple: let nature do its job. But by the time the creek was restored, the damage to the community was done. Families had left, unable to deal with the stress or the financial burden. Houses sat empty, for sale signs lingering far longer than they should have. Those who stayed were wary, skeptical of every decision the HOA made, unwilling to trust blindly ever again. The board members who had orchestrated the concrete disaster eventually resigned, unable to withstand the backlash. New leaders were elected, ones who promised transparency, accountability, and most importantly, humility. For me, the whole ordeal was bittersweet. On one hand, I felt vindicated. I hadn't needed to scream or fight or prove myself. The floods had done all that for me. Nature had spoken louder than I ever could, punishing arrogance and rewarding patience. On the other hand, I couldn't ignore the pain my neighbors had endured, the thousands of dollars lost, the memories destroyed in waterlogged basements. Yes, the creek was back, but the scars it left behind were deeper than the concrete ever had been. And yet, there was a lesson in all of it, one I hoped everyone would carry forward. You can't control everything. You can't bulldoze your way through nature and expect it to obey. The world doesn't bend to arrogance. Water will always find its path. The earth will always reclaim what is hers. And when you try to silence her, she doesn't whisper. She roars back with floods, with sinkholes, with destruction. That night, as I listened to the creek flowing again, I realized I didn't need revenge against the HOA. I didn't need to rub their failure in their faces. The truth was, they had punished themselves far more than I ever could. They had buried their credibility in concrete, and no amount of restoration would bring it back. They had tried to erase the creek, but in the end, it was the creek that erased them. The neighborhood would recover, slowly but surely. New families would move in. Children would play by the water again. And one day the floods would be just a story told over backyard fences. But no one would forget the lesson. Don't mess with nature. Don't let arrogance blind you to common sense. And never ever trust a clipboard-toting HOA president who thinks she knows better than the land itself. Because when you try to fill in a creek, you're not just fighting water. You're fighting something far bigger. And in that battle, nature always wins.